Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Scientia. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jim Pomerantz, Professor of Psychology at Rice and Director of Scientia. And this is our second lecture of the academic year in a series that we're calling simply Animals and Humans. We have a treat in store for us today, and that we get to hear from Lisa Meffert, who's a faculty member and a Scientia veteran and a member of the faculty in Rice's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. It'll be my pleasure to introduce Lisa in just a moment. But first, let me start out by thanking Alistair Norcross, who gave us our first colloquium of the academic year back a month ago, talking to us about carnivores and something or other about puppies. Thanks, too, to Joan Strassman and Hanak Scheinman, who followed Alistair as panelists. If you missed Alistair's talk, I'm pleased to say that a copy of it is up on the web, and if you go to the Scientia website, you can follow the link there and watch it in its entirety, including the comments from the panelists and questions and answers from the floor. I'd also like to give a special thanks to the 4 individuals who served on our special Scientia panel on hurricanes and Houston, which took place back on September 21st. It was supposed to have focused on Hurricane Katrina and what would happen if a major hurricane ever hit Houston. As it turned out, Hurricane Rita was bearing down on us even at the moment that the panel was taking place. If you missed this special panel, perhaps you and your loved ones were stuck on I-45 with an empty gas tank sweltering in the heat and humidity. I'm pleased to say that a videotape of that panel is also available for viewing in the coolness and quiet of your own home at this point. I'd like to thank our 4 panelists who served on that one, and that includes our own Steve Kleinberg, who's a member of Scientia, Phil Bedient, Bob Stein, and Houston Mayor Bill White, who, as I'm told, will be returning to campus in May to give our commencement address. So this year's theme is entitled Humans and Animals. We're focusing on our relationships with animals. They serve as our companions, religious figures, icons of beauty, sources of clothing, food, power, protection, and even sources of knowledge. We're attempting to take a fresh look at our ever-evolving connection with animals and ask, among other questions, whether animals are mere biological machines and what is the ideal way in which humans can interact with animals. Following Lisa's talk today, we have 2 more talks scheduled in the fall. On Tuesday, November 15th, we'll hear from another Scientia veteran, Jack Zamito, from our history department and also chair of German and Slavic studies here at Rice. He'll be speaking on, well, his title is If Animals Are Machines, So Are We, calling Descartes' bluff in the 18th century. Rounding out in the fall semester in December 6th, we'll hear from Huda Zogby, who's a physician in pediatrics and neurology and neuroscience at Baylor College of Medicine. She'll be speaking to us on mouse studies and what they teach us about neurodegeneration, deafness, and breathing. In the spring, we'll continue with a balance of our schedule, and that will include Carrie Wolf from Rice's English department, Tony Wright, who's here today, who's from University of Texas Medical School, Department of Neurobiology and Anatomy. And for the Bachner Lecture, which brings in an outsider from beyond Houston, I'm pleased to say that our Bachner lecturer will be none other than Irene Pepperberg. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Irene Pepperberg, let me say that she's an expert on the behavior of African gray parrots, and we'll be talking in particular about her African gray parrot named Alex, who at a minimum will redefine your notions of what animals are and are not capable of doing cognitively, and perhaps will redefine your own personal definition of what constitutes language. It's possible, outside possibility, that Alex the parrot will actually deliver the Bachner lecture, although we've been negotiating with him on his airfare and hotel accommodations, and he seems to be one very demanding parrot. Before I introduce Lisa, let me again note the format. Lisa will talk for, I guess, about 40 minutes, give or take, and I'm pleased to say that our format, again, today, like at Alistair Norcross's talk last month, includes a panel, and our panel will have an opportunity to respond and sort of stretch out the talk. Panelists include Paul Harcum from Rice's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, Jennifer Corsian, who's an undergraduate participant. I can imagine what it must feel like to be sitting here as an undergraduate talking to this august group, but Jennifer's game to do that. And Stan Mays, who's the co-director of the Houston Zoo and Rice University Consortium on Conservation Biology and curator of herpetology at the Houston Zoo. And I imagine we'll be hearing more about that as the talks evolve. We'll then have 15 minutes or so, the usual, for questions and answers, followed by a reception outside with food and drink, again, meat-free, I believe, following Dr. Norcross's talk. And an opportunity for all of you to talk among yourselves and with Lisa and the panelists. So now for the reason why we're here today, to hear from Lisa Meffert, again from Rice's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Lisa's research deals with quantitative genetics, speciation, sexual selection, animal behavior, and conservation biology. She uses the common housefly for experimental approaches to how to investigate complex traits like mating behavior and morphology, and how they respond to selection and to inbreeding. She's conducted selection experiments to simulate speciation through divergent female mating preferences. My guess is that there aren't too many of you in the room today who've used banks of camcorders to videotape houseflies as they mate, but after today's lecture, you may have found yourself a new hobby. Others of her experiments have evaluated the effects of inbreeding on complex traits. Her results suggest, among other implications, that the standard assumptions of capturing breeding programs for endangered species are overly simplistic. For example, in their efforts to preserve small populations of species, zoos go to great lengths to prevent the potentially damaging effects of inbreeding. Lisa, on the other hand, has suggested that such measures may not always be necessary and, in fact, in some cases may be detrimental. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation and has been published in such journals as American Naturalist, Environmental Entomology, Animal Behavior, Evolution, and the Journal of Evolutionary Biology. Lisa graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in 1982 from the University of Houston and then went on to take a PhD from that same institution in 1988. She's accumulated a noteworthy list of accomplishments in her academic career. Among those involve serving as a grant advisor for the program in animal behavior for the National Science Foundation and for serving as well as an advanced grant review panelist also for the National Science Foundation. Closer to home, Lisa has been recognized as both a distinguished and an outstanding faculty associate. I forget which of those is above the other. They're both quite impressive. She's been a frequent speaker in all sorts of venues, ranging from the local, speaking here at Scientia in 2002 on Darwinism as paradigm science, to talks she's given regionally across the state and nationally as well. Again, closer to home, Lisa is helping the Houston Zoo to develop a captive breeding program for the alligator snapping turtle and is helping to establish a consortium in conservation biology between Rice University and the zoo. And so, as always, let me ask you to turn off or silence your cell phones and pagers or anything else you have that makes noise and listen to Lisa Meffert, whose title is Humans as Custodians of the Animal Kingdom, Concerns in Conservation Biology. Lisa Meffert.
How's my mic? Can you hear me all right? Good? Thank you, Jim, for such a nice introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very flattered by the invitation. So today we're going to talk about, first I'm going to talk about the history of zoos in their roles for educating the public in the importance of biodiversity and also in direct efforts to preserve endangered species. Then I'll touch base on the mass extinction that we happen to be in right now. Then I'll move on to some of the controversies in conservation biology. When you read the newspaper, it makes it sound like we all know what we're doing. But the thing is that this is such a new science, and it's exciting to be in a new science, but it means that there's so many things that we don't understand we need to work out before we make these irreversible decisions in trying to save endangered species and preserve biodiversity. Then I'll touch base on my housefly experiments, just touch base on houseflies. Sorry, no video this time, but come to my lab, I'll show you how houseflies mate. It's really interesting, believe me. But those are our experiments on understanding the genetics of inbreeding and the genetics of near extinction events, and then how we might apply these research questions to applied efforts to save endangered species. And then I'll move on to, we're going to end with an upbeat note as opposed to the last one, no offense to anybody, but upbeat note about the efforts that we're doing with the Houston Zoo and Rice University Consortium in Conservation Biology, co-founded by Stan Mays and myself. And there's some undergraduate representatives here, including Jenny, who have shown that this is just an extremely exciting educational research opportunity. Really, I think one of the most important things I've ever been involved with in my whole life. Rice comes number one. Okay, my husband, never mind. So the abstract noted that, you know, here we are, in a sense, the physicians for the problems in biodiversity. And just vaguely speaking, you know, the Hippocratic oath for physicians is to, above all, do no harm. Can we say that we're doing that in our efforts to preserve biodiversity and save endangered species? The answer is, again, there are so many questions and controversies. And I think what I'm going to do is probably leave you with more questions than answers. I have to say that if I do have an opinion, I'm going to give it, because the whole reason I'm here is because I am fascinated by animal behavior and by biodiversity. One of the opinions I could give you, remember, did you see the Noah slide that I just accidentally skipped to? I can say while his intentions were good, he was more than a tad optimistic on how to resurrect an endangered species from single male-female pairs, okay? Good idea, bad strategy, okay? So the earliest zoos were really private collections for the rich and famous. Probably they've been dated back to about 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Here's an example where you can see exotic animals, for instance, the giraffes on the tomb of this high authority in Egypt. But again, these were private collections. These were just stamp collections by the rich and famous. It wasn't until about the 13th century where Henry I had his own menagerie, which was moved to London by Henry III, again in about the 13th century. And this way, we're now starting getting to more the educational mission of the zoos, where there's some more public access. I can't say that we had a whole lot of, they had a whole lot of respect for the animals at this time, where if instead of a mission, you could bring a cat or a dog to feed to the lions. And then Stan told me at some of these early zoos, if you paid admission, you'd get a stick so you could poke at the animals. And I'm not going to say that that's entirely gone in our current zoos, because the last time I was at the zoo, the curator of birds, Li Shun, told me that he had to pull a family out of the flamingo exhibit because they thought it was a good photo opportunity. So be nice to the animals. All right, so here, it wasn't until about the late 17th century that the zoo business was in order. And here's a postcard from the London Zoo in 1908. At the same time, American zoos and zoos in other parts of the Western world were being well established. The Bronx Zoo at this time had a famous exhibit where they had a pygmy person on exhibit with the primates. And that's not a good idea. And it was actively opposed by a minister, not because it was unethical to keep a human on exhibit, but because the exhibit had so much educational value, as he observed, to support Darwin's theory of evolution. So he fought to shut that down. You might have heard that recently the London Zoo has had a similar exhibit to show this evolutionary process, but in this case, the humans were volunteers, so that's okay. So now we're talking about, we'll go back to the educational value of zoos, but here we are. Here's my gloomy, doomy part. We're in the middle of a mass extinction. Okay, over half of the, that's defined as over half of the species going extinct in a small amount of time. Now, mass extinctions have occurred in the past, and some of them have been hypothesized to be driven by these sort of acts of God, these meteor strikes. But the one we're in right now, this one's our fault, okay? And even historically, you could say maybe several thousand years ago, humans were involved with anthropogenic extinctions. Usually when they invaded new islands or new territories, something had to go. But the rate of extinction that was estimated to be happening due to humans was about one extinction rate for every 55 years. So now, what do you think the extinction rate is due to humans right now? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Instead of one extinction every 55 years? The conservative estimate is 100 species a year. A scarier estimate is 27,000 a year. Now, I know that makes it sound like we don't know what the heck we're doing again, because we've got these wide estimates, but at least we know it's orders of magnitude higher than the background extinction rate. And we're doing a really good job at this mass extinction in that the natural mass extinctions took hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. We're carrying this one off in a couple of millennia. So we're really good at causing extinctions. I know, scary. Where most of the extinctions are occurring is the tropical rainforest because there's just a high density of species there. And so this is where we're going to get those estimates of up to 27,000 species going extinct per year. Just think about that. Even the conservative estimate of 100 per year means that by the end of this week, 2 more species will have gone extinct. That scary estimate says that there are 3 species would go extinct before the end of this Scientia talk. So we need to do something about this. And again, a lot of the extinction problem is occurring in the rainforest. And here I'm going to bring up one of the ethical dilemmas, is that how can we, in our SUVs and our air conditioning and our fad diets, tell people in these less glamorous, conditions that they can't tear down their environment in order to create a more luxurious lifestyle? And I think Paul will answer to that in a better detail. We know that deforestation is not good for the land. It doesn't make it very good for agriculture because the soils are so nutrient poor. So one of the efforts to counter this problem is to make ecotourism a viable monetary resource and actually make it a better economic value than deforestation. There are times when we've actually gone through the trouble of causing our own extinctions. So here, this quote here is General Sheridan to the Texas State Legislature about the end of the 1800s. And he said, "These men, the buffalo hunters, have done more in the last 2 years, more to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 30 years. For the sake of lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffaloes are exterminated." So this was a deliberate effort by the U.S. Army to cause the extinction of the North American bison in order to cause the extinction of the North American Indian. Now that's pure evil. Okay, we all know that's evil to try to wipe out a culture, and we did a pretty good job of that, nearly. We did a really good job on the North American bison. It was in the tens of millions before this campaign, and they brought the population down to 200. Now, in the past, that was at the late 1800s, but now only, 150, even less than 150 years later, the populations are well established into the hundreds of thousands. And they've saturated the national parks where we've put them. And you can order buffalo meat for food. And actually, I got this image from a website where you could do a canned hunt, so you can actually kill these for fun if you want. In Canada, they're still considered threatened, but at least we know that a big animal like this, which has a long generation length, could crash down, the population could crash down to a small size, and it can recover if we just leave it alone, stop killing it. And this is where I get on one of my soapboxes. Okay, I know I'm a purist. I might be the only person in the room with this opinion, but I don't think that humans really have the right, if that's the right word for it, to cause an extinction purposefully. As someone who studies speciation, I see true beauty in the concept of a species being a unique genetic identity that's been living and breathing in an evolutionary sense for millions of years. It has a right to be here. So just like you as an individual are a unique genetic identity that has never been here before and will never be here again unless you have an identical twin, a species represents that on an even grander scale. So I would argue, I'm not even convinced that we should cause the extinction of, let's say, smallpox. We have it contained. I'm okay with having it contained because it's a bad thing. But does it have any kind of right to be here? Now, maybe this is one of the questions I'm just posing to you. You might say, well, we've got it in the freezer. We've got it, the genome sequence, so we've got all the information out of it that we need to know. But no, we know where it's gotten to in evolutionary sense, but we don't know where it's going. And the recent threats about this Asian flu or bird flu pandemic tells us that we don't know enough about how these viruses evolve. So here's sort of, if nothing else, maintaining species will maintain this genetic experiments for us to improve human health. Indeed, a lot of the potent medicines used in cancer research are from tropical plants. If you were to kill those species, you'd lose that medical advantage. So knowing that we're in a mass extinction event, we get to the problem of what species to save. And here's the case of the California condor. This is a magnificent creature. It has a wingspan of 10 feet. And it was fairly common, but then habitat destruction caused it to go down to about 22 individuals. And efforts to captive breed this and release it into wild have brought the population up to about 200. So again, we have a big charismatic organism. We can save it if we try. To be fair, this effort has cost about $25 million. And so people would say, with such expensive projects, and there are problems with releasing the condor, these things keep electrocuting themselves on power lines. They're working on that problem. It's a beautiful beast, but it's awfully stupid. You don't have to be very smart to eat dead things. Think about it. But the argument would be, look, if we can only save a couple thousand species in, let's say, captive breeding programs, why bother? The counter argument is that, well, let's say the Louvre on fire. I mean, should we just go ahead and let it burn down, or should we run in and get some Leonardos, or whatever artist you think is worth saving? I think it's probably worth to get some Leonardos, or if there's an art historian here, I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. So that's an expensive project. And you notice a big animal, something with feathers, something with fur will help. So here's a cute little organism, the black-footed ferret, which is also involved in a captive breeding program. And it's been very successful. Again, this one's about $25 million. So that runs to about $600,000, $800,000 a ferret. And people will say, you know, with human populations suffering disease and famine, can we not spend this money elsewhere? My counter argument is that every morning I read in the newspaper about the hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent making movies and watching them. I think the money's out there. Maybe Paul will address a better way to, maybe a smarter way to apply it. But I think this tells us again that we can have populations crash to very small size and rebound, and we can save endangered species. But you know there's a bias for these charismatic organisms. In this case, there are very, very few efforts to save endangered species of arthropods or insects. And one that is under protection is the FENDER'S blue butterfly. And again, there always has to be this charisma factor. I can't help but think that if it were FENDER'S beige butterfly, it would be toast. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that we do want to save endangered species. And I've done experiments on this, and I'll show you my charismatic organism for doing that. Here's an example of the Micronesian kingfisher, which was common on the Isle of Guam. And with the introduction of the brown tree snake, it has wiped out so many populations of birds. What happened was the kingfisher in about 1970s got down to the size of about 50 individuals. So this was crisis mode. So the idea was to bring all the birds in and then breed them to start a release program, save the endangered species. So Stan, before we had the formal collaboration through the consortium, gave me access to the stud book data. So stud book data are the records that zookeepers keep on who mated with whom and who ate a bug today. Incredibly dense data sets. So what you have here is the pedigree of the remaining Micronesian kingfishers at the time I was evaluating that pedigree. And you'll see that the males are squares and the females are round, and you can see the offspring in the descendant generations. And then you see that the light dotted lines are the recommended breeding strategies for saving this endangered species. And the idea is to preserve as much genetic variation as possible so that when you release the individuals back into the wild, they have as much evolutionary potential as possible. And you also want to balance the founder contributions, genetically speaking, in the descendant generations. So you really don't want, let's say, one pair of founders to over-contribute to the descendant generations because you have a different genetic architecture than what you started with at the beginning of the captive breeding program. Now, my concern here is that you see the breeding pair in the middle, the male and the female, where they have 5 sons and 3 daughters. Note that the sons have been shut out of the breeding program because the idea is that they can't over-contribute to the descendant generations. Now, my concern is that what if there's a genetic reason that breeding pair is doing so well? Why don't we just go ahead and let them over-contribute to the descendant generations? Because what we end up doing is we have a breeding pair that's not doing well. We'll go through extreme measures such as cryopreserving sperm, effectively sterilizing individuals, or sometimes snap sterilizing the individuals. And scary enough, sometimes if there are space restrictions, they actually cull the members of the endangered species, they kill them. So I can tell you, we do not know enough about the genetics of small populations to be making these irreversible decisions. But maybe based upon what we know already, this is as best as we can do. What really scares me about this kind of thinking is that these predictions about what would be the best way to resurrect this endangered species are based upon computer simulations. And a computer simulation is only as good as its assumptions. And if you've ever tinkered with simulations, you can make them come out any way you want. And that scares me. So sort of beating the pulpit for my kind of research, we need to do these experiments so we can, and we need to do them fast. So I mentioned that they have often cryopreserved sperm because they want to make sure that this individual mated with this individual because that's what the simulation said should happen. And in some cases, let's say with the Sumatran rhino, apparently it's not very easy to get sperm from a rhinoceros. I know that I wouldn't want to try. And so what happens is they'll actually try to move the individuals from one breeding location to another, and tragically the animals will die in transit because they just freak out from being in an airplane or something. So in this case, this is a very sad title for a paper in the Journal of Conservation Biology, helping a species go extinct. So again, we might be actually putting these animals in greater peril than if we pretty much left them alone. I'm worried about that. In the case of the Florida panther, recall that a standard captive breeding design is supposed to minimize inbreeding also, so breed the most distantly related individuals. And they'll take this to the extreme, where in the case of the Florida panther, they've integressed the Texas cougar, a closely related species, into the Florida panther. And I'm worried about that, because remember how I said a species is sort of its unique genetic identity? Well, when you take two species and make them collide genetically speaking, you haven't saved one or the other, you've created something else. I'm worried about that. I'm saying I'm worried about that. I promise this will end on an up note. So I would argue that these interspecific hybridizations are probably never a good idea, because we all know about inbreeding depression. This was brought up in the last lecture. Something about Arkansas people make a sport out of inbreeding. I don't know about that one. But there is such a thing as outbreeding depression, and that means that two species don't like to mate with each other. Okay? That's outbreeding depression. It's important to note here that at least efforts are being made to save a big predatory cat, because you'll find when we're talking about which of those paintings in the Louvre to save, on average, humans will not make a lot of effort to save something that's a major predator on humans, that stampedes humans, that poisons humans. So at least in this case, we're saving a big cat. Now, I tend to think that maybe the reason that some of these projects get through that bottleneck as far as deciding who's going to save the species is that if it has a name like the Florida panther, you can see that the Floridians have some kind of ownership and then thus some sort of sense of responsibility to the species. I think there's something to that. I bet, who knew that we have our own toad, the Houston toad? Good. Bufo houstonensis. Yeah, these are all people in conservation biology. So I asked Stan, who was involved in resurrecting that species, if there were any left this morning. He said there are some patches, but recent surveys in the field have shown that the sex ratio, the ratio of males to females, is 10 to 1. That's not good. All right. So hopefully we can keep our toad. Yeah, it's not a big cat, but at least it has bones. I know. So another thing that concerns me in captive breeding programs is sometimes things like these really big megavertebrates, so big things with bones, sometimes we have trouble breeding them in captivity. They hate humans. They don't like to be around them. And in this case, the Asian elephant, there's an article here in Zoobiology. The need for Asian elephant imports may make the species a perfect candidate for establishing and maintaining an extractive zoo reserve. They're worried that by the year 2050, the captive population of the Asian elephant will be extinct, so we need to bring more in from the wild. We have to make sure that we're not hurting the wild populations in doing that kind of a strategy. Ideally, captive populations will be self-sustaining, and there are efforts to make sanctuaries for the Asian elephant so that we aren't hurting this species. But again, for some cases, we just don't know enough about, in this case, the reproductive biology of the species in order to make a viable breeding program for it. Here's a success story, the golden lion tamarin. I mean, this is truly a charismatic organism. It was common in Brazil until habitat fragmentation and medical research knocked its numbers down to about 50 individuals. I mean, and this is a spectacularly beautiful organism, and you need to go to the zoo and see them. As an animal behavior person, I could watch them all day long. They jerk their head, and it's kind of weird. I love them. And they can jump from branch to branch. They're beautiful. And the captive breeding program here has been very successful in such a way that they've been actually able to release the excess individuals and saturate a habitat with the animals. And in this case, they preserved the entire habitat. So all the other species, plants, animals, insects in that habitat have been preserved in this effort. So this is a flagship situation of an effort to save endangered species. Okay, going from charisma to less charismatic. This is a common housefly. This is my animal. We can do experiments on near extinction events because it's very easy to rear. I can have hundreds of populations if I want. The generation length is only 4 weeks. So I could do I could simulate a breeding strategy for endangered species in less than a year, which would be the equivalent of 200 years in a real captive breeding program for something like a megavertebrate, like a bison or a rhinoceros. We just finished a 20-generation experiment, which would be the equivalent of 500 years of a captive breeding strategy for a megavertebrate. So yeah, the charisma's gone in this system, but it's just a very good experimental model. So I always have to have a dump slide. This is the worst part of this job. In order to start a new experiment, we always go to the garbage dump, and of course we want to start with a happy, thriving population and simulate the near extinction event. So yeah, we go to the dump in August when the heat index is 113, and you know that humidity and temperature makes that garbage smell really ripe. I mean, you can taste it. I don't do it anymore. I send the students out. So we've done these experiments, and just recently I came out with a paper in Zoo Biology that under certain restrictions we showed that yes, indeed, that standard captive breeding design to balance founder contributions and to minimize inbreeding is the best thing. It does reduce extinction probabilities when you simulate the extinction into the release into the wild. But recent data that we've just collected, and we all know about the glacial pace with which things get published, shows that under less restrictive population growth constraints, you probably don't need to go through such heroic efforts in order to minimize inbreeding and balance founder contributions, as long as you just avoid incestuous matings. So you don't want parents mating with their offspring, and you don't want full sibs mating. Full sibs are individuals who share the same parents. You know, if you just avoid the incestuous matings, you probably don't have to cryopreserve sperm and ship rhinoceroses and whatnot, but under these different conditions. The idea is that ultimately, I think we'll understand enough about the genetics of small populations to make the right prescription for each case. So just like if you were to get a cancer, you wouldn't want some global treatment for every kind of possible cancer that can be had. You'd want that treatment tailored for your particular syndrome. And I think ultimately we'll know enough about the genetics of small populations to be doing that for all these different species that we would care to save. So going on to the just concept of animals in captivity, I remember when I was a kid in the 60s that we went to the Berlin Zoo. And the only thing I remember about that trip was a chimpanzee in a cage, just a box with bars, banging its head against the wall. I mean, this is not good. We know that's not right. But zoos now always have what are called enrichment techniques to try to improve the behavioral health of the animals. And a lot of that's going on. We'll talk about that with the Consortium project. There's actually an international organization, ZooCheck, which is involved in making sure that the animals aren't miserable in captivity. And this is a good thing. I certainly condone this. But their ultimate goal is to eliminate zoos altogether. And I can't agree with that. I think the enormous educational value of zoos far overwhelms any of these problems. And we can remedy these problems. We just have to want to remedy these problems. People have argued, well, maybe zoos were important when we had, before we had movies and television and the web, but now that we have these resources, we don't need to keep animals in captivity anymore. And I can't agree with that. I mean, looking at a giraffe on the web is not like standing next to one. I mean, giraffes are so cool. You have to watch them and stand next to them and see how enormous they are. how their legs seem to articulate backwards, and what's up with those horns? Those horns are used for courtship. I mean, it's so fascinating. And the zoo is important. You need to smell the animals. I mean it. So every time I go to see a stand at the zoo, I get this silly grin. I know I can feel my cheeks are tight. I get this silly grin because the smell of all that exotic animal poop is just fantastic. And Stan even said, you know, you have to smell those wolves. They're really good today. I mean, he said they had a patron say, prescribed a dog shampoo to make the wolves smell better. You know, you're not getting the point there. So, and moving forward in the educational value and the applied value of efforts to save endangered species, we co-founded this Houston Zoo and Rice University Consortium in Conservation Biology. And here we have zookeepers and undergraduates brainstorming ideas. So the zookeepers, for instance, with these enrichment ideas, have hypothesized, you know, certain ways that they might make the animals happier. Or we have, Jenny will talk about her efforts in conservation biology per se. And then the students take this idea and sort of expand it. So the zookeepers have an idea, but they're way too busy to collect data in a methodical way. So the students expand this idea into a hypothesis-driven research project in order to address this issue. And as part of the agreement, the zoo staff can now apply for visiting scholar status here at Rice and access our library resources and audit classes. So here I'm going to talk about some of the success stories. Diana Cox, she's here. Hello, there she is. When these students come back from their first day at the zoo, so what happens is the students get this backstage pass. The zoo is another world. It's beautiful. And the first day she came back, she was just glowing. She said, I got licked by an okapi and I got to pet the baby giraffe. And I thought, man, I never got to pet the baby giraffe. And so her project, this okapi was grooming itself to the point of causing wounds. That's called self-injurious behavior, SIB. And not a happy okapi. So the idea was okapis have these long tongues. They're related to giraffes. And so the idea was instead of just plopping the food down on the ground, okapi gobbles it up and then gets back to this aberrant grooming behavior, to give it a puzzle box. So give it this sort of maze where the food is shoved in there in a funny way, where the okapi has to move its tongue around and work in order to get the food. And when Diana did her poster at the annual spring session, the title of it was Playing with Your Food. And then in the results section, there were all kinds of exclamation points saying it worked. So the puzzle box was able to improve the quality of life for this individual, this okapi. And then Joanna, I can't pronounce your last name. Baniewska. I should know that. My mother's side is Polish, but every time you see a Polish name, you want to buy a vowel. I'm sorry. But so Joanna's working with mole rats, and these are animals that are so remarkably ugly that they're truly beautiful. And they have extremely complex social structure where there's a queen rat and subservient worker rats. It's wild. And her idea is it's part of an enrichment technique as well. And here's what I'm going to say. You know, sometimes there's a little bit of conflict of interest where we want the patrons to learn about biology, evolution, biodiversity, animal behavior. But sometimes animals would rather hide than anything else. And so now we've really lost not only just the entertainment value of this display, but also the educational value. So she's going to try to come up with some way where they're not doing so much hiding. The mole rats are in a new exhibit at the zoo, and it's a splendid exhibit where they actually have multi-species assemblages, so try to show the different kinds of biosystems that there are on the Earth. Then Jenny's going to talk about Atwater's Prairie-Chicken. This is a case where, and she'll go into more detail, I'm not sure that we really should be applying the standard captive breeding strategy for this species because it's a chicken. I mean, they lay a lot of eggs now. She'll explain, you know, as part of the success story and some of the problems of this. But, you know, I really think we can save this species, but I'm not sure that the best strategy is the standard one. I think we don't have to go through such extreme measures. We'll just get that population up and worry about the genetics later. And by no means, they've suggested hybridizing this bird with another subspecies, the lesser prairie chicken. And again, I really don't think they have to do that. So here I am thinking that they should try some perhaps slightly alternative method for saving the endangered species. But now I worry, what if I'm wrong? And then I've contributed to the demise of the species if they took my advice. But I don't think I'm wrong. Well, no, I don't think I'm wrong. And here's Amaris. Amaris Swan is a graduate student. She's working with the alligator snapping turtle. And here's another species. This is the largest freshwater turtle in North America. These guys are huge. They can get up to almost 200 pounds. And so they don't move around a lot. They just stay where they are. And so there's some suggestion that these guys might be really sort of adapted to inbreeding, that really going through efforts to make sure that there's breeding amongst most distantly related individuals just might not be necessary. And so my final slide is going back to sort of the humanities concept. We've had this where sort of people think that, well, humans have dominion over the fish and the fowl and the cattle. And I love this part, every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Some people take this as meaning that we can go ahead and exploit them. But I think that the way I interpret this general idea is that we need to take better care of them. I know we can. It's a beautiful world, and I think we can do a better job of taking care of it. I know that we should. And Stan actually brought me a prop. It's so sweet. He brought us each a globe paperweight for just participating in this project. Thanks, Stan. So, save the planet. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa, for a terrific talk. We're going to move on now without delay to the panel, but keep your questions in mind because you'll have an opportunity to ask them of Lisa and of the panelists as soon as we finish their presentations. They've decided to go in alphabetical order, starting with Paul Harcum.
Thanks, Lisa. Lisa's shown us that we've come a long way in our treatment of animals, at least in zoos, and changing relationship over the years. She's illustrated to us that zoos can be valuable forces for conservation, and she's even shown us that houseflies are good for something. So, thanks, Lisa.
Be talking a little louder. I think they're having trouble hearing you in the back.
I will try.
Is it turned on?
Yeah, it seems to be on.
Okay.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. But knowing that Lisa was going to try to convince you to save everything, including smallpox, I thought perhaps I could at least suggest to you that there are a variety of reasonable reasons to save species as well. And so I thought I'd just review these for you briefly. Of course, one reason is we do it because it's right. And many people are persuaded by this argument. Lisa has persuasively argued that. Others will argue that, we save species because there's just something spiritual we get out of our interaction with nature and with species. Another good argument, persuasive for many. But then there's also a very strong utilitarian argument as well. And since money is the thing that seems to talk in many ways in this day and time, I thought I'd expand on that a little bit, particularly with respect to the value of what we call ecosystem services, things that natural systems do that contribute in a useful way to human life. There's quite a long list of them. I don't need to read them to you. I will point out that we probably. I forgot to add that in addition to flood mitigation, there's a hurricane mitigation. Recent experience with marshes south of New Orleans. I don't need to perhaps convince you that how important economically that can be. So overall, ecosystem. The bottom line is ecosystem services can be very important. By protecting species, we protect ecosystems, and we contribute materially directly to human well-being, perhaps to the extent of $30 trillion, which is approximately the value of the total world's economy. So whether or not you like smallpox, saving species is a good idea. And I think that, this is one of the things that relationships to zoos here is that zoos, because they house charismatic organisms, can really hook people. They're a great way to draw people into conservation. they're a great platform, I think, for explaining to people that saving species are some of the pragmatic reasons for protecting species and ecosystems. Now, let's see. Oh, and I wanted to just briefly touch on the subject of Amazonian deforestation. Lisa mentioned that as a major cause of loss of species worldwide. It's happening as we speak. Illegal logging is one of the in the Amazon basin is one of the major causes. I thought I would. The rate has gone up dramatically in recent years. You may be interested to know that of those illegal logs, something like a third of them, I'm told, end up in the United States. So, something to think about. But we might ask, well, why is it going on? Well, here's one man's answer. It's a matter of survival. Or, what's he supposed to do? Not eat? Well, that's kind of one of the standard responses when we say we need to protect environments like the Amazon. But I think it's and so it's a legitimate question. What do we do about those people who find themselves in marginal situations on the frontiers? Somehow, I don't think a mill owner is likely to be the one to starve, but nevertheless, it's a question that we need to address. And there are lots of things we can do. Probably the most important is, as Lisa was suggesting, for preservation of species in general. There's plenty of money to do it, I think. We really need to, but one of the keys is we need to own up to this need to search for alternative solutions to poverty. And so I guess there are lots of ways that we can approach this. My point is that the conservation biology that goes on at the zoo and that Lisa has described is really just the starting point. And that in order to solve the problem of species extinction, of loss of ecosystems, really requires building on the strong base of conservation genetics and biology that she and Stan and the students at the zoo are doing, by contributing ideas and efforts from the full range of disciplines represented in a place like Rice. Anthropology, sociology, economics, humanities, the other sciences. All of us can play a role in helping to protect ecosystems, and so we should all think about how we might contribute to this particular cause. Thanks.
This is a first today. It's the first time we've had a speaker followed by panelists, each of whom have their own slides. So our second panelist is Jennifer Corsian.
No, it's a black. Good. I'm here to tell everybody about conservation from a student perspective. The first thing I want to start out with is working with the consortium has changed my life. I now know what I want to do with my life. I want to continue working in conservation research and possibly work on educating the public about the threat so many animals in this world face. I was kind of skeptical when I got involved with the Prairie-Chickens, though. I was thinking, chickens. But I talked to the zookeepers that worked with them so often, and they were so passionate and really genuinely cared about the animals, and their enthusiasm was so contagious. And then I got to get in there and see the behind-the-scenes stuff, and there is nothing that compares to that, and I have not encountered anything like that before. Getting to see the animals and smell the animals and touch the animals, there's nothing. I love Animal Planet. That can't duplicate it. I'll never forget one morning. I was walking towards Boomtown, the Prairie-Chicken habitat, and it was a really foggy morning, and I just heard them doing their mating call as I slowly approached, and they just kind of guided me through the fog one morning, and it was really surreal and really incredible, and I will never forget it. But it's an experience that's becoming all too rare as these animals face extinction, and that brings me to the Prairie-Chickens. They are critically endangered, and there's down to about 40 in the wild, up to the most current data I could find. Zoos in institutions in Texas have breeding populations of about 200. And they're releasing animals into the wild each year to supplement the current wild population and trying to rebound the numbers back up enough so that they can be stable. But they're threatened due to loss of habitat. There's only 2 small populations left in the wild on protected reserves. They are a lekking species, which makes them behaviorally really interesting. They do this little mating dance. They erect those feathers on the top of their head. They blow out these air sacs on their necks and eyebrows. That's the bright orange that you see. And then they do a dance. They kind of scuttle around on the floor and attract the females. So the males aggregate and dance, and the females come, choose the male they'd like to mate with, mate, and leave. That's their mating structure. The breeding programs have been making good strides. They've released 750 into the wild, and so that's really helped. But the problem is only about 25 of the eggs survive. Like the Houston Zoo this year got 103 eggs and was only able to release about half of those, which is better than normal, but still not stellar. That's where they called me in. One of their problems is they wanted to see if they could get some help with rejection of mating pairings. There's a high incidence of either getting no eggs from a female or getting infertile eggs. And I looked at their behavior. I sat out there in a blind and watched them in the morning when they're active. And I looked at 6 behaviors and found that males pacing was an indicator of mating discontent, which means that they are likely to have more infertile eggs and have lower reproductive success in general. And I found that male aggression was a good sign, good indicator of mating success. And traditionally, I also found that the males that were located towards the center of the enclosure, here's a diagram of the enclosure, those in pens 1, 2, and 3 were traditionally, in the past year's data that I looked at, collected by the zookeepers, were more productive individuals than those on the outside. So one thing that I started to wonder was, is this artificial lekking? Are the males in the central pens at like the perceived center of the lek automatically given a reproductive advantage, or are the ones at the end given an automatic reproductive disadvantage by being at the perceived outer edges of the lek? Are we setting up their social status somehow? And I'm thinking that more research needs to be done, but I'm tempted to agree with Dr. Meffert that if we let them lek and just avoid direct inbreeding, that they might help us take care of them better. So that's what I have to say.
Microphone. Okay, we'll do our microphone handoff thing here now. And our final panelist is Stan Mays from the Houston Zoo. Stan, how does our campus smell to you?
Smells very nice, you know. I haven't been around the garbage cans yet, though, looking for flies. Can you all hear me all right? Okay, great. Okay, first off, since I'm curator of reptiles and amphibians, no cute and cuddlies on this thing, you know. Cute and cuddly, there's two animals, there's types, there's reptiles, there's prey, okay? This is a rare animal. This is an Angolan python, first bred at the Houston Zoo. That's why I popped it up there. Now, the idea of using zoos as hedges against extinction of certain species is a pretty new one, and it's actually occurred in my career time at the zoo, or at zoos in general. The first American Zoo and Aquarium Association endorsed species conservation programs, which we call SSPs, species survival plans, did not have their beginnings until 1981. So the idea of conservation biology and the science of conservation biology is also a pretty new one. And it's a recent development, and it's still evolving. And it's made great strides. Lisa's made some great strides in increasing our knowledge about conservation science, but it's still a crisis science. It's a reactive science. It's not a proactive science, you know. 2 years ago, the big problem with herpetology was the mass extinction in Asian turtles. 67 out of 95 were considered vulnerable or in imminent danger of extinction. Last results say about a third of all amphibian species are now in danger of extinction. So we bounce from one crisis to another. It's not really an ideal situation. Now, your modern zoo can play a role in species conservation, but it cannot and it really should not be considered the only solution. We play an important part, but a good species conservation program requires a multifaceted approach. Okay, it needs cooperation between government and non-government organizations. It needs also zoos. It needs an education program, and it needs both captive and field conservation plans. Okay, and it's always a good idea, it always sounds great, and I think every zoo person will agree that it's easier to conserve a species in the wild than it is to conserve a species in captivity. But you can't just go out and buy up land and hope that does the trick, because you have a lot of problems in government, when you're in land ownership. Number one, a big one is you can own all the land, but if the animals aren't there, you still have to put them there. Another problem is the infrastructure has to be in place first. We can go and we can buy all the land to protect the mountain gorilla, but until we solve the problem of the poaching of the mountain gorilla and giving people a way to sustain themselves so they don't have to poach the mountain gorilla, it's not going to work. And then also just the stability of the governments is a problem. You can't acquire land with the idea that in 2 months, 2 years, 10 years, it'll be gone. Now, the main contribution that we can make is in terms of heightened awareness. And in this, we're pretty successful. This is the results of a recent Harris poll put out in May. And of the people polled, 86% of them agreed that visiting zoos and aquariums encouraged people to donate money or time to animal conservation efforts. 96% agreed that it's important that people work to conserve animals, and again, they find them in the zoos and aquariums. That's what they relate to. And then 95% agreed that many of the successes to save endangered or declining species are at least in part a result of work done in zoos and aquariums. There's probably some controversy about that, but it looked good to us, so we kept it. Okay. Now, one advantage to zoos, and that Lisa brought up, and I'm going to bring up, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove it to you, is that we do allow an interaction of senses to be involved in an animal experience. You can see the animal, you can touch the animal. You can look at an animal on TV, and it doesn't do the same. It just does not give you the same aspect. And I'm going to prove that to you, okay? Okay. This is the Florida indigo snake. How many people here knew that we have a Texas indigo snake? Okay, good. And again, you could see this on TV and yawn, but as soon as I pulled it out, even though you're sitting in the back, you're noticing it. Okay, you see it. And since I don't want to use him as a pointer, I saw Dennis back there. He's another one of the consortium students, and I'm going to have him hold this thing while I finish. Do you want to? Dennis will show you how. Okay, so that, again, now 2/3 of you aren't even going to listen to me. Okay, now we still have a lot to learn, though, about endangered species and about conservation programs. And I should just stop now. On the snakes aspect, very, very well. The parrot is not as happy. Okay, now, right now, currently, captive species are conserved through cooperative programs among zoos. And the species that are most in highly need of conservation plans, we use what's called the Species Survival Plan, the SSP. And this is to help ensure the survival of selected species. And here's what we do. We organize scientifically controlled managed breeding programs as a hedge against extinction. We cooperate with other institutions and agencies to ensure integrated conservation strategies. This is where the zoo and rice consortium has really come in handy. Lisa has taught us a lot that we really need to learn, and she gave a great talk to a taxon advisory group meeting of all zoo people in herpetology about 2 years ago. That was extremely well received and got a lot of talking. If she realized how much now we're talking about our programs, I think she'd be very proud. Also, we're going to increase public awareness of wildlife conservation issues and conduct basic and applied research, which again is something that the Rice Consortium is very valuable with. Train wildlife and zoo professionals. Obviously, it's working. Also with Dennis. Also, develop and test various technologies relative to field conservation, of which Lisa is doing, and reintroduce captive bred wildlife into restored or secure habitat as appropriate and necessary. Is anybody listening? He likes you, Dennis. Okay, now, I'm going to end up with talking about what I consider one of our better run species survival plans, the Aruba Island Rattlesnake, SSP. And I guess I should say before this, right now there's 106 species survival programs that we manage species, and we have another 282 species that we conserve on a lesser scale in what's called a population management plan. Now, the Aruba Island rattlesnake, I love these things. It's a very small rattlesnake. It's less than 3 feet long. It's found on the island of Aruba. Lisa was talking about stud books. I am the international stud book keeper for this animal, so I know where basically most of them are, except for a few in Europe. Now, early on in this program, it was realized that we needed a multifaceted approach in the development of long-term conservation strategy that did not necessarily have to look at reintroduction as a tool. And just so, everybody thinks about Aruba, that I go there and I sit on the beaches. These things aren't found in the beaches. This is where these things are found. This is the interior of the island. It still beats the hell out of a garbage dump. But, so I'm not complaining, especially after seeing that. I'm not complaining at all. Now, so along with a captive program, we formed an education and public relations program. And this is a summary of some of our accomplishments. We've established a public relations education program, like I said, on the native flora and fauna. And this is all the flora and fauna on Aruba. This is taught in the lower school grades, and we actually have workshops. We conduct workshops for the teachers, and they use this as part of their curriculum. And what has happened was with this public relations, with this education, the attitude of the people of Aruba has changed. They no longer look on the rattlesnake as something negative. Instead, it's something positive. It's something to be proud of. So they have created, a few years ago, the Arikok National Park, which preserves vital habitat for the rattlesnake and other native wildlife. This park covers almost 35% of the island. It's a good-sized park, even though the island's small. Now, we've also initiated field research to learn about the natural history and ecology of the rattlesnake. And one thing that I want to point out is that we've established a stable captive population of about 175 snakes in the United States. This is genetically viable, and we're replacing this animal because you want to use a minimum number of animals possible because you don't have that much space. So this ensures a ready supply of Aruba Island rattlesnakes for other zoos that want to display this species. And one thing we've done with this too is we do not sell these animals. We do not trade these animals. We donate these animals back and forth. One of the things that is the best way to kill illegal poaching and the illegal smuggling of animals is to kill the market. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're killing the market. And another thing we're doing is we're trying to control or eradicate the introduced boa constrictor population on Aruba. This boa constrictor population, introduced a few years ago by people that had them and just let them loose, is surviving and breeding there. It is not hurting the rattlesnake. They live in different parts of the habitat, but it is just playing havoc with the bird population. So this is an example of how you look at the full ecosystem. And then finally, the Aruba Island rattlesnake, if you ever go to Aruba, you get a 25 florin bill. That little snake on there is the Aruba Island rattlesnake. Now, just ending to say that the island of Aruba is admittedly a very ideal situation. You have a very highly educated population, about 98% literacy rate. They're affluent, okay? They're making livings. They don't have to use the wildlife to make a living. And then finally, the government is very stable. So you have all three aspects that are already in place so you can establish a conservation program. And thank you for inviting me.
Thanks a lot, Stan. Thank all of you. And now this is the time for all of us to get to ask questions. I'm going to be on this side of the room with the microphones. And Steve Kleinberg is already in position on the other side.
This is a question pretty much for the whole panel, I suppose. Currently, how are species chosen for conservation, and how should they be chosen in your opinions?
I can tell you right now. There, is that better? You know, there's a variety of aspects they look at, like when you put an animal into Fish and Wildlife for listing as an endangered species, population trends, habitat destruction, things like that. But really, one of the ways that I've noticed in zoos for these conservation programs is that every species has to have a champion. It has to have somebody or a group of people that really care about that animal. And in the case of the Aruba Island rattlesnake, it started off with one guy back in the mid-'70s, Carl Peterson, who, Lisa knows Carl, who took it upon himself to go down and start looking for rattlesnakes in Aruba and started noticing there was problems and started working on bringing some back into the United States, establishing a breeding program. And again, it all comes down to a champion. Is that the right way? No, I don't think it is, but it goes back to the idea that if you don't want to do something and it's assigned to you, you don't tend to do as good a job as if you really want to work with something. So if you assign me to work with ducks, I probably wouldn't do that good of a job. But rattlesnakes and all that, oh, that's something I'm interested in. But open for suggestions.
Concern was expressed at a number of points about inbreeding. And we all know that's a bad idea. But I don't know that I know what happens if you can't avoid it. In other words, if you just have two individuals and you're stuck with that, you have to form a population. What happens? Will the population crash, become extinct, or what?
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes in the captive breeding programs, we have no choice. There may be only 4 individuals left, so you're going to have to inbreed somehow. So what you do is strategize. In that case, probably you do want to minimize inbreeding as much as you can while you try to get the numbers up. But I think the thing that is not always appreciated in conservation biology, or at least applied aspects, is that in some systems, animal systems, there is an adaptation to inbreeding. They normally inbreed. So things like your top predators might be fairly well adapted to inbreeding. We call it the purge effect. And we've done a lot of experiments on that too, and so populations can sort of go through that nosedive towards extinction and then pull out. Yes, that nosedive is very serious and could actually cause this species to crash as an extinction event. But we know that they can also pull out just depending upon the life history of the species, its inbreeding history, and so forth. So that's why, like with AMARIS's alligator snapping turtle, that's a case where we think that that species might actually be fairly well adapted to inbreeding, and so you don't have to worry about it that much. It tends to be things that are typically have very large population sizes and move around a lot, that they'll have most of the inbreeding problems. Things that typically have small population sizes and don't move around a lot, probably inbreeding depression is not that bad a deal. So I think that's underappreciated.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can comment about Texas in particular, because Texas has a lot of private land, as opposed to some other states which there's a lot of public land. And I was wondering what the conservation efforts are on those private lands, right, if any, compared to, say, public lands, which there are some but not much.
I know as far as the Prairie-Chicken reserves have gone, a lot of public lands bordering on the reserves, they've taken part in these things and are letting the Prairie-Chickens come onto their lands and maintaining their, yes, private lands that are around the reserves that the Prairie-Chickens are being put on. And they're cooperating with us and putting their efforts into maintaining this land as good habitat for these birds. So that's one way that they're handling it.
I could contribute to that. Mike, you may know that not too many years ago, the Nature Conservancy was approached by one of the oil companies, and the oil company offered to sell them about 1,000 acres of land down near Texas City, which had one of the two, at that point, one of the two last remaining wild populations of Atwater prairie chickens. And the Nature Conservancy kind of thought about the public relations and implications of buying land and then the prairie chickens going extinct, which was a decided possibility. So they said, well, no, thanks. We probably won't, we'll put our money elsewhere. So then the oil company came back and said, well, would you take it for free? And Nature Conservancy said, well, could you give us some money to build a building? Well, this story takes a lot of twists and turns. Subsequently, they discovered a big gas field under that piece of property. What's the relevance of this? Well, much of the proceeds of from the gas field actually went into both purchasing land for additional Atwater's prairie chicken habitat and doing the legwork to acquire conservation easements from private landowners in order to attempt to establish a new large prairie chicken reserve down past Victoria. So there are some non-governmental organizations in Texas that are actively involved in both acquiring land, which is private, and also in working with private landowners to encourage them to provide incentives for the protection of endangered species in Texas. So there are efforts that are going on that sort of mitigate for the fact that the overall amount of public land in Texas is lower than it is in some other states.
I have a question. I have mixed feelings about zoos, I must confess. And so what I would like to know is for animals that are exceptionally intelligent, let's say like elephants, or animals that have in their normal lifestyle have a huge range that they roam over, let's say like panthers, what do you do in a zoo context to make it suitable for animals of that type so they don't suffer some kind of psychological damage? Anyone care to address that?
Yeah, actually there is a program that Consortium has been working on, this idea of environmental enrichment, and that is also now a USDA requirement and an American Zoo and Aquarium Association requirement that you have to have for all primates, for elephants, for your large cats. You have to have an active enrichment program going on and be able to show that it is working before Well, so the USDA can't lift your license, and you can still get accreditation. Now, one thing you have to do sometimes is you have to substitute one behavior for the other. For example, animals that travel a long time, one of the reasons they travel is because they're foraging. So what you do is you make it so they have to forage in their exhibit, so they have to look around for stuff. Or you do what we did with the okapis. When we can't figure out what else to do, we do something artificial, but at the same time, it gives them something to do, and it does engage more of their mental senses. In terms of elephants, elephants have always been a problematic, and now I know the AZA has recommended, not only recommended, they are now requiring all zoos that hold elephants to contribute to the creation of a large elephant sanctuary. I think it will be located somewhere around California. Again, I am not really an expert at it because, you know, to me that's megafauna. You know, yeah, they get all the money anyway. But that is my meager knowledge, and if you'd like, I can give you some names and phone numbers of some people that know a whole lot more than I do about it.
So are there criteria that are actually used to assess how long the strategies are?
Yes, there are. I can't tell them to you. I know that there's different criteria set up by the USDA and the AZA, and that the AZAs tend to be a lot more stringent. We actually have animal care standards set up for most of your large species like that give, you know, minimum exhibit sizes, what sort of behaviors should be promoted, trying to think of other things, you know, but what sort of behaviors to avoid, what you don't want to look. The last thing you want is an animal that's pacing in a figure eight all day. That's not good for anybody, and it gives no educational value whatsoever.
Great, thanks. I want to hold up our side of the room here with a question. And it may be an unfair question, but you started, Lisa, telling us about that we're in the throes of a horrible extinction, maybe the worst ever in the history of life on this planet, certainly the one being caused by human beings in a way that none others have. And then the rest of the talk has been quite encouraging and positive about various steps that are being taken and new knowledge that is being acquired. And I'm just wondering if you could help us think about how does it all look 20, 30 years down the road as we try to balance all of these different forces. What's your sense of where we're heading in terms of our responsibility as stewards of the animal world?
Well, I think Paul will be able to answer to this also, but I think once it becomes an economically viable and important objective to save habitat and endangered species, then we'll probably do a better job of it. So right now we still feel like we can burn up all our fossil fuels and go ahead and wipe out forests, and don't worry, there'll still be plenty of species left. So it's also, again, as Stan said, we have to get into real crisis mode before people start to care. You know, and already people do care about megavertebrates, so we have to get them to care more about the entire ecosystem, entire communities, and things like all the way down to butterflies. And don't worry, housefly won't go extinct. But I think Paul is better at making these kinds of long-term projections.
Do we have time?
Well, I guess I would just say that in my view, it's touch and go. We got a lot of world problems, and as I tried to indicate, many of them are intertwined. So I'll make a deal with you. You solve the world poverty problem, and I'll take care of the rest.
And you're right; they're absolutely interconnected.
We'll be back in touch on that next year. Last question.
Okay. This might sound a bit trivial, but I was thinking that one of the institutions that do have extensive breeding programs is the International Kennel Club. And I was wondering if there has been any cooperations between zoos and kennel clubs, because I'm aware of breed restoration programs after the Second World War, and from what I know, they have been pretty successful with that. And I know that a lot of research has been put into different dog breeds, well, probably because it's a major hobby and people like to spend money on it. So has there been anything like that?
I don't know about the International Kennel Club, but I do know that another conservation issue that is being approached by a lot of the children's zoo parts of the modern zoo, which children's zoos are pretty neat too, is the conservation of rare breeds. A lot of your cattle breeds, sheep, goats, there are many of those breeds that are in danger of going under. So they are working with those associations. I do not know about if the various SSPs for like the Red Wolf and all that are working with the kennel clubs or not, though. I can try to find out.
Well, before we go on to the reception, let me thank Lisa, let me thank our panelists, Paul and Jenny and Stan, thank Dennis, thank all of you for coming. Please be sure to come to hear Jack Zamito in November, and please join the snake and the rest of us for a reception outside.